Hello and welcome to the program. I'm your host, Neal Howard. Thank you for joining us here on Health Professional Radio. Now, it's likely that you or someone close to you know someone who struggles with alcohol and drug addiction. With nearly 21 million people currently suffering and more than 23 million people living in long-term recovery, addiction to alcohol and other drugs impacts 1 in every 3 households here in America. Our guest today is Mr. James Hood. He's CEO of Facing Addiction, and he's going to talk with us about a recently launched Addiction Resource Hub. Welcome to the program, James. How are you?
Neal, thank you very much. I'm pretty good, and I hope you are as well. We appreciate the opportunity to be on the air, and I will tell you this is a very important subject to me. I lost my oldest son, my beautiful boy Austin, to this damn thing 5 years ago, and it simply means I understand what this does to families all across the country. Every 4 minutes we lose somebody's son or daughter to this thing, and we're here to put a stop to it.
What is it that defines an addiction? How does one know when he or she or someone else is actually addicted to a substance?
Well, that's such an interesting question. It's 2 parts. The answer is it is a chronic, relapsing brain disease, which simply means it is an illness, not a moral failing. You're not weak. It's an illness, but it's chronic. Once you become addicted, you certainly can be treated and you can get into recovery, but it is chronic. It's never gone forever. But your other question about how does somebody know when they are a loved one or addicted can be really elusive because it can be hard to spot. People are good at denying it themselves. Frankly, people are good about lying about, I don't really have a problem. It's not as bad as you think. So it falls to loved ones, Neal, to really do everything they can. If you suspect there's a problem, there probably is, and you got to help that person with all of your heart and all of your will.
Is there any distinction between the effects of addiction to illegal drugs and legal drugs? You know, we're hearing about 2 epidemics, the addiction overall and opioids specifically. Most opioids are prescribed.
Right.
Is there any distinction between the treatment and the recovery effort?
Well, and it's a really smart question, Neal. I'm not a doctor, and it would get into a very long, answer, but there are certainly different protocols that seem to be more effective if a person's addicted to alcohol versus prescription drugs versus heroin. But broadly speaking, they are all addiction, and the problem is getting worse. And as you said, it impacts 1 in 3 households in America, and we've neglected this problem in America far too long.
Now, Facing Addiction and the NCADD, they've created this Addiction Resource Hub. Is this something that is being improved upon as far as resources when it comes to addiction? We've been hearing about recovery and recovery programs for many, many years now.
Yep. It's a new resource, Neal. It's free. And people can use it online. You get to it by resources.facingaddiction.org. And if you were to go there, I can just tell you briefly from the journey with my boy, Austin, it is really hard to get reliable information when you or a loved one are struggling with addiction. Most of us aren't experts at this thing. We don't know what to do, where to turn. And a problem is if you go online and search, a lot of the information that comes up is not accurate. Some of it's downright deceptive. Some of it can literally kill a person. So you create a resource like we did, and it's user-friendly. You go online, a big map pops up. You put in your zip code because you probably want resources close to you. It makes sense. You say, I'm looking for information about prevention because I'm concerned my child could have a problem, or intervention, or treatment, or recovery, or housing, or, it goes on and on. I think there's 11 choices, and we'll keep adding to it. And then the map lights up, and there'll be 200 or 300 resources rather near you. And then you can click on them and get more information about hours and what they offer, and whether you think it's for you or not. But this is an extraordinary resource. We've already mapped 50,000. We call them assets, but places. We've already mapped 50,000 places on this map of the country. We'll be at 100,000 before the end of the year, and people out there who know about a resource that we don't. it's great. They can contact us. We will check it out. We'll add it to the map. Right. So it just keeps getting better and better.
A moment ago when I was talking about possible distinctions between illegal drugs, alcohol, and prescription drugs, there is a stigma associated with being called an addict or someone thinking that they may be addicted. Talk about overcoming the wall of stigma when it comes to seeking help for an addiction.
Boy, are you right in that observation. And part of it, this is not remotely directed at you, but part of it is even our language. The very fact that, we call someone an addict is so tainted. When you hear that word about a person, you probably think less of that person. Whereas if you said a person who's suffering from the illness of addiction, you'd be like, wow, that's terrible. They're sick. Mm-hmm. Right? And I mean, there's a lot of language stuff, that matters here, and it's complicated. But the whole issue of stigma, Neal, is so complicated. Treating people who suffer from addiction as criminals, which we frankly have done for 40 years, puts a stigma around it. If a person doesn't believe that addiction is a illness, then you probably think it's a matter of weakness or moral failing, and you think less of that person, right? So there are many aspects to stigma that we absolutely have got to overcome, and we got to start facing this thing as the illness that it is, because it's eating us alive.
Now, you are the CEO of Facing Addiction. Now, this is in conjunction with the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. Were you involved with the NCADD prior to spearheading this initiative, Facing Addiction?
Great question. No, I was the co-founder and CEO of Facing Addiction. It was a separate organization, not to bore your listeners, and NCADD, a wonderful separate organization with a 74-year-old history in America. Those two organizations that have a similar mission, right? The mission is to address this addiction crisis and turn it around. We decided we'd come together and create an overarching organization that's bigger, more powerful, has kind of boots on the ground, because look, Neal, we're up against this thing that is now the number one cause of death for people under 50 in America. Right. That's a big, formidable problem, and we decided we need a big, formidable, organization to try to go slay this dragon.
Have you noticed in any of your travels, talking with people, dealing with people who are dealing with addiction, are there any special challenges that, say, older people, younger people, men or women seem to face when they're dealing with addiction? It seems with so many resources, we should be able to tailor recovery efforts, or is that a fantasy?
It's a very informed question, and I hate to tell you, it's all of the above. Given a person's life phase, life stage, there are certainly different manifestations. This opioid crisis is particularly horrific because it's not the majority of cases that a person uses opioids once and dies, but it can happen, and it does happen, to be quite blunt. Whereas in general, people who suffer from alcoholism, let's be honest, it's usually a slower onset and it's a longer process. So that takes you to a different place. Lots of times among the older generation, they've gotten a legitimate prescription for pain after surgery or something, and they may not have done anything, to abuse that prescription, but after 4 or 5 days or 2 weeks, somebody that you couldn't imagine is suddenly addicted. So it takes many different shapes and forms, Neal, but we've got to have solutions for everybody, for that 1 in 3 households in America that is suffering from this thing.
Now, you mentioned the website a little early on in our conversation. Once again, tell our listeners where they can go online and learn more.
Sure. The resource thing that we just talked about is simply resources.facingaddiction.org. You go online and it's completely intuitive, it's self-explanatory, it's free. You can even set up your own account. So when you go back, the places that you've identified and you kind of said, that's good for me, you can save it. You can save your favorites. The other thing, though, I would say, Neal, with great humility, is an organization like ours, needs funding from the people. The average person out there can make an enormous difference, just as they do with funding cancer and heart and diabetes and Alzheimer's work. So people who would go to facingaddiction.org and please consider making a $10 a month contribution, I am telling you, I pledge to you, it will make a huge, huge difference, and you'd have my personal thanks.
Hey, thank you so much, James Hood, co-CEO of Facing Addiction. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us with this information today.
Thanks for your time, Neal. Anytime.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neal Howard. Transcripts and audio of the program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, listen in and download at SoundCloud, and visit our affiliates page at hpr.fm.